guys, welcome back to my channel. It is the end of the month, so it is time for my March wrap-up and my April TBR. God, I can't believe we're that late into the year already. I seem to have hit a bit of a holding pattern in that this month I also read 5 books, like January and February, so let's just go over what I did. You may remember last month I read Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief for one of the Pop Sugar reading categories of a book that I got out of the library. So I continued my read of the series, which means that I got through Sea of Monsters, which is book 2 in the series. I'll put a picture of the book here because I got it out of the library, but I've already had to return it. And then I also managed to get through book 3, which I did get out of the library, but I still have, which is The Titan's Curse. So you might remember from last month that I didn't really like the first book. I thought that The Lightning Thief was somewhat incoherent, kind of a mess. It was very inconsistent in terms of its tone and pacing, and like the stakes tended to vary a lot and the characterizations were not that nuanced. But I'm happy to report that the books have improved drastically since that fairly rough start, I'm gonna be honest. It seems like Rick Riordan is kind of learning on the job because book 2 had much more consistent pacing, and it helped that they didn't have to do any of the introductory stuff that they had to get through in the first book, but the introductory stuff was handled really badly in the first book, so it was a huge help to not be dealing with any of that, and to just, you know, have one clear goal that they were working towards the whole time instead of jumping around to all these different things. Anyway, the plot of the first book is that Zeus's lightning bolt has been stolen and he has to go on a quest to retrieve the bolt and find out who the real culprit is because they think that he's the culprit, even though, you know, he's totally not because he didn't even know that he was a demigod when the lightning bolt got stolen. The second book, Sea of Monsters, begins when Percy gets a sort of prophetic dream from his satyr best friend Grover, because we all have best friends who are satyrs, and Grover is in trouble and is sort of sending him these telepathic messages about how he needs help, and they go on this quest to this Cyclops island to retrieve the golden fleece of the Jason and the Argonauts story of the myth. There's some fun new characters, like we meet a baby Cyclops whose name I've forgotten but is Percy's like half-brother because his dad is also Poseidon, and we get to see a little bit more of some characters that we were introduced to in the first book that we didn't get to see a ton of, like Clarice, who's the daughter of Ares, who is kind of great. Like in the first book it's a little bit problematic because Rick Riordan really likes to make his mean characters ugly, like he just keeps going on about how ugly they are, and there are various problems with that because we have a long-standing cultural trend of beauty equaling good and ugliness equaling bad, and those are obviously not great concepts because they're not true. But he's toned down on that a lot, and I do actually really enjoy Clarice's kind of bloodthirstiness since she is the daughter of Ares, who's the god of war. She's very much into just like punching things and setting them on fire, and it's kind of fun. So the third book, Titan's Curse, is the one that I've most recently read. I got done with this one while I was sick last weekend. I ended up using it for a book you can finish in a day because I basically just took a sick day and read it. And I will say that about this series, is that if you're not feeling great or if you just want something light and fun or you're tired or something like that, they are written for younger kids, so they are just like a fun, light read. And the mythology in them is actually pretty solid. Rick Riordan did a lot of research, it's pretty clear. The whole basis of the story was that he was reading myths to his young son and then ended up sort of writing his own stories after they ran out of myths to read, which meant that, you know, he read basically every myth, including some really obscure ones that I've never heard of. So the basic plot of The Titan's Curse is that Percy, Annabeth, and Grover, and another person who is kind of a spoiler, are all going into this school to find this brother and sister pair who are demigods that they have tracked down, and they're gonna try to bring them to Camp Half-Blood in order to keep them safe from the monsters that otherwise would try to kill them. And this goes super well, as you might expect from the fact that this is how the book opens, and Annabeth ends up sort of tumbling off a cliff and disappearing, and Artemis shows up with a bunch of her hunters, and they sort of chase off the monster, but then Artemis has to go on a hunt, and then it turns out that like she's disappeared and in trouble, so the hunters and the campers end up teaming up together to go find Artemis and figure out what monster she was trying to hunt, because she says that, you know, there's this monster that's come back that's been gone for millennia and it's like the most dangerous monster out there. So they're trying to figure out what this monster is and how to get Artemis and Annabeth back. The one thing I'll say that I found really weird about this one is that it takes place in Marin County, which is where I grew up, which is the county across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco, which no one ever talks about. Like, this is not a place that ever gets things written about it. The battle, like, takes place on Mount Tam. Like, who in Marin talked? Because no one knows about this if you don't live in Marin. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's so rare that anything from my hometown gets featured in a book that I actually found it kind of charming, but also really weird. So I've now gotten through book 3 of 5 of the first series, but there is another 5-book series after that, so I'm counting it as 3 of 10. I am going to keep reading the series, as you will note in my TBR list, but overall I'm enjoying the series and they are definitely improving, which I am really happy about. So since I am going to keep reading the series, I will let you know how the rest of it goes. The next book that I got through this month is not going to be a surprise because I've featured this series in every wrap-up video so far. It was Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. I'm always a little unsure how much to talk about my reread of the Harry Potter series because I feel like basically everyone has already read this series, or if they haven't read it, they know that they're not going to. And everyone has their opinions, and everyone has their really strong opinions. And I respect that everyone has their really strong opinions because I have really strong opinions. What I will say is that I had genuinely forgotten how rough the ending is of Goblet of Fire. I'm assuming this is not really going to be a spoiler because again, I'm assuming most of you have already read this series. Before this most recent reread, if you'd asked me what my favorite book of the series was, I would have absolutely hands down told you Goblet of Fire. I still think that that's probably true, although I'm gonna wait till I finish the series to, you know, say that definitively. My least favorite, however, is Order of the Phoenix, which is the next one, which is why I haven't started it yet. I think the thing that happened is that when I was reading these books in print, I was much younger, and I think it didn't really sink in how traumatizing the end of Goblet of Fire was for Harry. Because to me, as a reader, I just had read so many other books that had similar kind of arcs that it was almost like I'd become desensitized to the whole idea of what was happening to him. You know, it was sort of what I expected to happen next in the logical progression of the story, and so it just didn't really occur to me how horrifying that was to him. And it wasn't even just the scene in the graveyard, it was also the scene in the hospital bed with Cornelius Fudge and his absolute refusal to believe Harry. And that level of gaslighting was really actually kind of frightening coming from like the authority figure. He is the Minister of Magic. He's basically the Prime Minister slash President, and he is saying that Harry is crazy and that Harry is dangerous and that he doesn't believe anything that Harry is saying, even though like multiple people are backing him up on this. It was terrifying to have that kind of authority figure just disregard him. So I think that a lot of my problems with Order of the Phoenix, which I'm gonna be honest, I think I've only read once or twice because I really don't like it, but I think a lot of my problems with it, 1, stem from that betrayal of authority figure, and 2, stem from Harry's attitude problem, I guess is what you could say. But I'm gonna have a lot more sympathy for his attitude problem, I think, which is actually maybe gonna make it harder, because now I'm not gonna be annoyed for Harry, now I'm gonna be sad for Harry, and I've already cried for Harry like twice now, so we'll see. So moving on from Harry Potter, the next book that I managed to finish in March is All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders. This is a weird book. I'm gonna be honest, like I'm not even totally sure how to summarize this. So the basic plot is it's about 2 main characters, Patricia and Lawrence. They meet when they're in middle school. Patricia is a witch and Lawrence is a burgeoning mad scientist. And I think because of these 2 main characters, it's actually really hard to pin down in terms of genre because it's this weird hybrid of sci-fi and fantasy. And I liked this book, don't get me wrong. I thought that this book was kind of unique in a way that I don't think I've read anything like it. But they meet in middle school, they sort of become allies because they're both ostracized from their peers, but they also kind of drive each other crazy and kind of make each other miserable in that way that's sort of only possible in middle school. And, you know, they're both tormented by bullies and they both have parents that just don't understand them in ways that are sometimes kind of horrific. And then the book kind of jumps ahead like 10 years until they're suddenly adults and living in San Francisco, and it's this sort of near future apocalypse where the world is kind of falling apart and there's this battle between science and magic happening, and they're sort of on opposite sides, but they also, since they've known each other forever, they also have this connection, and it's so weird. I don't know how to talk about this book. So I shelved my books in terms of like very specific subgenre, and so I ended up shelving this book with Mira Grant because it's that like near future apocalypse set in California. That was as close as I could get. So I guess the question is, since it's hard to talk about the plot, do I recommend this book? Did I enjoy it? Yes, I enjoyed it. Do I recommend it? Yes, with some caveats. There are some scenes that I found difficult to read, particularly the scenes sort of in the earlier parts of the book where they're being tormented by bullies, they're being punished by their parents. Both Patricia and Lawrence are very heavily ostracized. They are very heavily bullied. Lawrence mostly in more physical ways, whereas Patricia, it's more verbal, like she's constantly called crazy and no one wants to talk to her or hang out with her. But it also had scenes that were deeply funny. It's just such an odd little treasure of a book, but it's just so different that, yeah, I would say that I recommend it, even though I am having difficulty actually talking about it. So this was All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders, a kind of off-the-wall fantasy, sci-fi, apocalypse hybrid of a thing. Yeah, so the last book that I managed to get through in March is a very recent one. It is The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh. I've actually been meaning to read this book for a while because I picked it up at Comic-Con this past year. It had been getting some attention, and so I'd been meaning to get it for a while, and so I just ended up picking it up while I was down in San Diego. And then I just kind of put it on my shelf and didn't read it for a while. So I ended up reading it this past month for a book that is based off of a fairy tale because it is a retelling of the 1001 Nights. I can't remember if that's the official title or not, but it's the story of Scheherazade where she's telling different stories in order to not get killed. So in terms of fairy tale retellings, this one is fairly conventional, I guess you could say, or maybe conservative. I'm not sure what the right word to use is there, but basically it has the same premise as the original story and it has the same setting as the original story, the same basic characters. It doesn't take a lot of liberties with the original stories. What it does do, I guess, is give more of an explanation for why the king is murdering his wives every night, which, I mean, I can't remember if that was ever explained in the original story. I kind of think maybe it wasn't. And I'm not going to reveal what the reason is because it's a fairly major plot point that gets revealed later in the book. I didn't actually think that it was that big of a surprise. I kind of figured it out by that point, which is one of my like main critiques of the story, is that I did think it was a little bit predictable. But I really enjoyed the atmosphere of it, and I really enjoyed Scheherazade as a character, and I really enjoyed her relationship with Despina, her handmaiden, and Yasmin, who is the like princess from the neighboring country. Yasmin has a very small part in this book, so I'm hoping that she shows up in the sequel, which I will be reading. I liked this book enough to pick up the second one. I think this is the author's first book, and I think that maybe you can kind of tell. What it actually does do is it does break off from the whole idea of her telling stories every night in order to save herself for 1001 Nights. I think she only actually tells stories every night for like a week, and then they just kind of break off from that plot line. There's also a storyline about her like childhood love that I guess she was maybe engaged to, I'm not really sure. And I found him one of the less interesting characters. I think part of the problem is that, like I was saying, you could kind of predict where this book was gonna go. It's pretty obvious that she's gonna fall in love with the king rather than her childhood love, who is obviously gonna be the one that she's not that interested in, so therefore I wasn't that interested in him. And also it falls into the trap of the childhood sweetheart thinking that he knows Scheherazade better than she does when she's like telling him certain things. He just like doesn't believe her. So he wasn't my favorite character. I actually really did like her relationship with her handmaiden though, because her handmaiden basically straight up says at the beginning that she's a spy, and then they end up sort of having this fun pull where they both are aware that they're playing a game, and they're playing a game of information, which is all verbal. You know, it's all about getting information that the other person has without revealing the information that you have, and they're both very aware that they're playing a game, but they're also really respectful of the other person's skill in playing the game, and I thought that that was a really fun dynamic. It sort of changes throughout this book as the relationship between Scheherazade and the king changes, but I still thought it was a really good hook into the book when she's not totally sure what's going on yet. So overall, I thought it was a good start to the series, and I will be picking up the sequel. So that is actually it for everything that I read in March. However, I have sort of created a schedule and a vague idea of what books I want to read for all of the remaining categories for the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge. So because of that, I have a few different books that I wanted to go over for the April TBR. The first is Starflight, which is by Melissa Landers. I also picked this one up at Comic-Con. I am planning on using it for a romance set in the future, although I'm not actually sure how romancy it's gonna be, but if it doesn't work, I'll think of something else. I've gotten a tiny bit into this one, just like 15 pages, okay. But it is about a girl who basically contracts herself out as an indentured servant to the like most popular guy at her school, basically like the star quarterback type person, in order to get off planet because she can't afford the trip. And I think they end up getting like accosted by pirates. I'm not sure, but it seemed like a kind of fun adventure in space kind of novel, so I'll be checking this one out hopefully in April. The next one is a book I'm about halfway through. This is for the self-help book category of the reading challenge. I am reading The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, which by Marie Kondo, which is a book that I think everyone's talking about right now, so it's not a huge surprise. I have been finding it pretty helpful because I have been really trying to declutter my life for years and not been very successful, so this actually has helped me, and I will hopefully be finishing it this month so that I can, you know, finish getting rid of all the stuff that I don't need. Another one is book 4 of the Percy Jackson series. This is not for the reading challenge, this is just because I'm reading the series, but it is the Battle of the Labyrinth, I guess, which is the story of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur from the original mythology, but I can't remember anything else about that story, so this is up next, and will actually be happening in the next week because I have to return it. I am also in the middle of the audiobook of the Welcome to Night Vale novel by Joseph Fink and Jeffrey Craner. I'm a fan of the podcast, even though I've kind of stopped listening to it recently, for various reasons, actually, a lot of which have to do with the fact that I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks recently. But I'm just finding it so charming. The audiobook is read by Cecil Baldwin, who is the voice of Cecil Palmer on the Night Vale podcast, so if you listen to the podcast, it's basically like listening to a long-form episode of Welcome to Night Vale. One of the things that I'm really enjoying about this novel is that since it takes place outside of the radio station, you get to sort of experience the more day-to-day lives of Night Vale citizens than what you really get to see through the podcast, because in the podcast it's all a radio show, so it's all Cecil just like telling you what's happening. Whereas in the novel it feels more like you get into the sort of like little details that you miss otherwise. That's gonna be everything for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you've read any of the books that I've mentioned, let me know what you thought of them down in the comments, and I'll see you guys very soon with another video. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye!